Hello, my friends. I'm Rick, and this is your seat at the table. And we are looking at the technical readout for 3063. So, the height of the FedCom Civil War is in full swing. There's a number of clans that, within the clans, they're bickering amongst themselves. I believe the clan wars of Reaving are still going on at this point. I think. I don't know. I can't say 100% I'm sure for sure. But we see a massive renaissance in technology, and that began just prior to the invasion of the clans, but was really accelerated after that. So as the Intersphere militaries and houses tried to catch up technologically speaking with the clans, and to produce weapon systems that have some sort of chance, or at least sufficient numbers to bury their clan opponents. That's the one thing that I'm a big, strong believer in all this time, that the clans collectively, if all of them had descended on the inner sphere and had knocked out the inner sphere in a couple quick punch blows, they just been, at the end of the day, the clans have never had a chance of successfully grinding the entire inner sphere down. The inner sphere just can literally bury them under bodies and weapons, produce enough cheap tanks and enough cheap rifles and explosives, and enough people willing to die, or enough commanders willing to make people die, and you're going to have a problem. The best the clans have can still not fight 100 to 1 or 500 to 1. That's just the reality of things. It's just like one of the crippling issues amongst the inner sphere has always been the lack of FTL transportation. There's just not enough jump ships to get people around, and the production capabilities, even after all this renaissance takes place, is still pretty minuscule. We were lucky about a dozen new jump ships a year was being produced across the inner sphere prior to the clan invasion. We do not know and have any idea, at least I've never really come across any numbers that talk about clan production. We know the clans had the ability to produce brand new warships and brand new jump ships. That they didn't produce very many, in part is because they didn't need to. They had a whole shitload, in mothballs left over from the Exodus, plus their operational needs and things like that are small. On comparison to the inner sphere, the entire Kerensky cluster and their controlled space out there is barely a medium-sized house within one of the minor house within one of the major houses. You look at the four marches of the Federated Sons, for example. The Draconis March alone is 3 or 4 times the size of Clan Space, and probably has 15 or 20 times the production capacity, and God knows how much resources, let alone population base, just the Draconis March, as an example. So I always like these things when they come out, and obviously these were books that came out after I stopped buying stuff, which is a shame on my part. Like I said, though, I had circumstances back then that made it damn near impossible anyhow, and so I couldn't keep up if I wanted to. So I believe this is, I went through this, and there's so much information, so much good material. And every now and then I run across another little key to the puzzle of understanding the bigger picture of the past era, from the end to the conclusion of the Federated Civil War. And it seemed like to me the FedCom Civil War basically petered out towards the end, and then was completely overwhelmed by the jihad and Word of Blake's onslaught, just like most of the others were. And another thing, like I said, I really enjoy when I look at TROs, and they contain a lot of vehicles in them, because vehicles are, even though BattleMechs are the king of the battlefield, and the preferred item that we want, to game on the table or play with on the table, the fact that vehicles are such an integral and important part of all factions. Inner sphere, periphery, deep periphery, clan space, doesn't matter. There's just a sheer numbers of their purposes and roles, and is goes without saying. So the see inclusion of new stuff is always nice. So obviously we're not going to run around with an unarmed ammo carrier and fight, but it's nice to know that the stats and text and stuff's here, so we know what we could be working with if the situation were to be set up that way. And if you're looking at, a lot of it comes down to how you choose to play your game, right? There's a lot of players, and this is one of my detractions for this concept of battle value, because it encourages people to cherry pick, right? I mean, let's just use this as an example here. If this is representative of Wolf's Dragoon's Assault Star, this is a known faction, and we know they're using following clan practice, otherwise it's the 5 mechs opposed to the Inner Sphere's traditional 4. But if this is the second, if this is Alpha Galaxy's second cluster's third Assault Star, and we painted it up and marked it up that way, the battle value that's fixed in the star is what's there. So if we field this unit and their parent, the rest of its parent organization on a battlefield as players, we're not really should not have the luxury of going through, oh, I want this mech and this mech and this vehicle and this vehicle, because this is what we're doing. That really flies in the face of the whole table of organization and echelon layout that we set down in paper. So if I tell them I'm going to field this particular star, and they're going to be supported by that star, then the star is already pre-existing by whatever was fit into that vehicle, that star prior to the battle. I didn't just come in and say and pick 5 mechs at random and say I want to put these together because it tailor fits the scenario that we're going to have on the table. And for me, I find that to be a bit of a problem, because once again I think it detracts. So if you're just sitting down to have combat and I just want to match up some stuff, well, here's 5,000 battle value, because I'm working on the fact I've never played a game where I've had to deal with a damn battle value. So I'm looking at it from an outside perspective, and a perspective that's mired in the original set of rules. So when I look at that and I think we're just going to have a friendly competition and it doesn't matter, well then at that point I can see, okay, so to be fair, this is the amount of whatever we're allowing ourselves, tonnage or battle value or whatever, and you've put whatever in the field that meets your and doesn't exceed our agreed limit. So in other scenarios though is where we're sitting in a larger campaign, and this is where I bring an entire battalion of my mercenaries to the field, and we're going to have a mini operational missions going on, and so we're expecting to play anywhere from 5 to 10 sessions that's going to be involved in this campaign. So my merc unit has been hired to raid this factory, and so I'm going to come down, I'm going to set up, I'm going to scout the place out, I'm going to if I don't have reliable pre-information on it, I want to definitely scout it out. I'm going to maneuver, I'm going to get my logistics in order, and this involves a number of different things going on behind the scenes or off the table, but it's still being done on paper, so I have a paper trail to prove this is what I did. And that aspect, I said, okay, I'm going to have my second ammo platoon, or my second ammo lance from my logistics company, make sure I get a pre-stage a forward supply dump or rally point, so when I go after this target and I need to go back and reload, I don't have to truck all the way back, And if you're my opposing force, my opponent, opts to send out reconnaissance and set skirmish pickets and things like this, and this gives them an opportunity to perhaps stumble across that scenario. Then at that point it becomes, can my ammo carriers and whatever escort I thought to include with them can fend off his attacking force long enough for my ammo carriers to get away, or do they get taken out? And if he manages to take them out, early, how does this affect my longer term for the campaign? If the second operational mission within our expected 10 involves him knocking out 50% of my munitions before I actually see any major combat, how will that affect my progression down the road? At what point do I go, okay, I've expended 70% of my existing munitions, it's time to bug out, because you don't fight to the last bullet, especially if you're Merc. That's just foolish. And if you're invading, you don't. There's a cutoff point, and you need to leave yourself a sufficient window of supplies to withdraw. And if you expend all your stuff and find your ability to fight at all or grossly diminished, then it's a horrific victory at best, and it's a catastrophic loss. So I just like seeing them. So and then of course any new mech or vehicles is welcome, as long as they're not crazy, because there's a few that can get crazy. And there's some really good and interesting designs. And then there's some that's, a tank is a tank is a tank. You can only tweak them so often. It's like automobiles, Somebody says I should do a video on why are some mech designs abandoned, or they just, and of course I'm forgetting exactly what the phrasing was that he used, but it's just like automobiles. Think about 100 years of automobile construction. How many different makes and models of cars have been made and abandoned? How many of those models did we, us older guys, had when we was in our younger years that aren't available today? They came, they went, they got canceled, or they got replaced, and you go back. I mean, nobody drives an Edsel, except very rare, very few collectors. The majority of people even really know what the hell an Edsel is. For example, I never saw one in person. I've never ridden in one in person. My dad had mixed opinions on the one he knew about, but had never owned. And they weren't all that widespread back in the day, and now they're a collector item. So this is the same thing with machinery. We have a factory that can produce tractors and bulldozers. They can produce tanks and artillery pieces. And so in a lot of aspects, that's exactly what happens. So in a war footing, things get changed over. Some of these factories and stuff have gotten pretty proficient at it. And other factories have just acknowledged the fact that there are always going to be a need for some kind of military vehicle to come off their assembly lines, so they just add more assembly lines for that effect. And this gives us an even wider range of vehicles. And then you marry that to the fact that each major faction, each major house and clan has its own production facilities, and their ability to produce stuff is based off of either existing technology or blueprints and stuff, or something new. And generally speaking, it just means that House Creed's tank might look a little different than a Lyran tank or a Compellan tank will, but they'll still achieve the same goal, the same purpose. And then of course, because of that mindset, this is why just about every faction out there can possess vehicles that are produced by somebody that's not their faction. And it's common. Capture, purchase, theft, it just goes on and on. So I looked through, it took me a couple of weeks to go through this and read. There's just so much good stuff in here. And a couple of them I had to go back and read it again, because I was trying to understand a little bit about where we were and where we got to. And then here's the latest generation, or of that particular era of common mechs. So the Trench Bucket TBT 8K, right? Gallon gas. A lot of mech designs, as we all know, went defunct during the succession wars, in part because they needed the advanced Starlink technology to function and operate in the roles that they had been assigned to do. And when the factories were unable to produce this stuff or keep up with demands, or the production lines producing the mech was destroyed, and that happened a lot. And that first succession war was brutal on the infrastructure and on the logistics side of things. And the second succession war just about did the rest of it in. And so a lot of lessons were learned, a lot of hard facts, and that still plague the factions to this day. And so you can't produce the Ferrous armor, you can't produce the Miramar advanced, the mask, you can't produce any of these high level technologies and stuff, then that means that that machine is no longer going to be a viable machine because you can't replace the parts. And more importantly, they're not going to produce another one like it. So they're either going to completely revamp that frame and it'll come out as a different kind of mech altogether, or it'll be such a bastardized version of the original that it's not worth doing. And they just, or cost wise, it's just not going to. There's existing systems that are just fine. They'll do mechs. And they're cheaper to produce, easier to keep maintained, and more importantly, the factories and logistics systems are still in there and still out there and still chugging away. So, it's a matter how you look at it, how you perspective. So we see mech designs come and go. I mean, the original Warhammer was the Axeman or Battle Axe or whatever the hell it was. It was the Mackie, and there was a couple other designs, and there's a couple designs that were produced right after the Mackie that are still in production in modern day versions. But why not the Mackie? Well, the Mackie was in reality a test bed for the concept of a combat mech. The lore states that industrial mechs and stuff existed prior to the war mech. So when the battle mech comes out, it's because somebody decided to take the aggro mech and arm it, and now you got a mech. So the Mackie was a good design for its initial run, but it would be grossly outperformed by everything that comes 2 generations later, which is typical. And then I suspect also because it was not designed to be upgraded and to be modernized as it went along, the chassis and frame and things like that on those original Mackies probably just wore out faster, and they weren't able to be replicated. And better designs came, and cheaper designs came, and so the Mackie gets regulated to lesser and lesser details until eventually they're just they're showroom, they're museum pieces. It's a rare day to see one in action, although we hear stories of every generation or so at least one of these Mackies being wheeled out of some dusty museum somewhere and put in an act of desperation, put it into combat, which is, I find, incredible considering that they were a museum piece for hundreds of years. You wouldn't think any of their weapon systems would be functionable because they wouldn't have been maintained properly. Just goes to show you the level of construction in the future era, the era of the less disposable, because that's a problem with most of our crap today. It's designed to wear out. Once it wears out, we'll just buy a new one because it's cheaper to do that than it is to have the part replaced or fixed. So we look in these, and there's nothing that really leaps out specifically in my mind, but there's still such an interesting arrangement of machinery and mechs and tanks, and the artwork's not any better or worse than the earlier, probably the same people doing it. Not knocking you guys, I understand that this is, my hat's off to you. I could do this, it's just time consuming, and I don't have a knack for it. You have a knack for it and you really have a love for the particular art you do, you can do a lot of it and you can do it pretty fast and it looks great. And that's a key thing. A lot of people can do art, it's how long it takes you to do it and how often you have to go back and try to tweak it to make it satisfy that it works better. So we're back to some more vehicles. There's an interesting one. The Mind Flayer attachment for the Mastodon. And you just had to go and say that this is a technology that is a countermeasure to the Thunder artillery rounds and minefields. Minefields have always been there, in some generations more so than others. I mean, some houses use them far more than others. I mean, they serve a very useful purpose. They can also be a terrible plague on the landscape that they're left behind. So we have machinery that helps clear the way. That makes absolutely perfectly sense, and it's just modernized versions of existing time-tested machines. Here, so this is the same thing. So we get into this area of logistics and support, and other engineering vehicles and things like this that don't get a lot of glamour. They're not glamorous things, and but yet at the same time, they have a point and a place and a role. So when I talk about you know, a regimental combat team, for example, with 10,000 plus soldiers and technicians and specialists and commanders, etc., and hundreds, literally hundreds of mechs and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vehicles, maybe even more. It's more important, they come with a lot of logistics and specialty units that you would not see in a smaller command. So, you know, a bridging unit is at hello, of course. It was a foregone conclusion that they had to have some versions of it. And mechs are great because they can cross certain terrains, but they can't cross everything well. And vehicles, not at all. So we're back to that. A lot of worlds have water and other issues. I mean, bridging, you talk about bridging equipment. If you're looking at a landscape, a hellscape from some kind of desert or scrub brush world where it's just fissures and deep chasms with very narrow passages, this thing will allow you to move people around too. I mean, it just was nice to see these things included. I mean, we'll never see minis of them, or very unlikely to see minis. It's just like we'll never see minis of everything that's in print. Mechs, tanks, aerospace fighters, you name it, in part because there's literally hundreds of them. What, 500-600 different mech designs and primary tanks at this point? I mean, it's just not practicality. You're not going to do it. But the fact that we have it is always nice. I was seeing I briefly watched somebody's battle video that they had on YouTube a couple days ago, and I'm watching it, and they're having a disagreement about something, and there's a couple lances of mechs on the field, and then the guy puts down one of the little cardboard tank or armored APC cards from the original box set. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, so he doesn't have a mini for that position. And if you ever seen those cards and pieces, they're kind of generic. They're not a specific type of vehicle, really. I mean, it kind of looks like an APC, so it covers just about any kind of vehicle that kind of looks like an APC. It's just how do you designate it. It's the same thing that like mechs and stuff. Some of you guys can look at a mini and identify exactly what mech and model of mech it is. I'm not quite that sophisticated. I'm not quite there. So I mean, so obviously there's an Annihilator, and lots of people don't like the Annihilator, which is fine. But it's I know it's an Annihilator, but I'll tell you, I couldn't tell you which one of the 12 different variants that is by looking at it. It just, the general look of it tells me it's an Annihilator. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe it's not an Annihilator. I mean, yeah, that's Annihilator. So, I've always thought, in my case, I paint the mini, I'm going to just have to write the model number on the bottom of the damn mech. Otherwise, that just, for most people, that just represents the mech on the table. The mini represents the mech. It's the stats, the paperwork sheets, and your cards or your whatever you're using that really is how you define which version. So you could have 3 of these things sitting on the field and have 3 different variants. Talk about trying to keep track of shit. I mean, there's a Vulcan. They really changed the appearance of that Vulcan, didn't they? I mean, the original Vulcan was pretty chunky looking, but I didn't have any issues with it. But here's a modern version. So we'll go back a little bit to what I was talking about before when we talk about designs that follow the wayside. Aesthetics change too, which is fully understandable. It's like if you look at the more modern version of the Atlas, a version against the traditional one that we, established, the game established as the Atlas. There's been some significant changes between the art, the aesthetic looks of the two machines, so almost to the point where you can make an argument that that's no longer an Atlas because it doesn't look like the original machine. The flaw in that mindset, or that line of thought, is once again look at the Detroit automobile industry, or the automobile industry across the planet, and I I have a car that has this design, and they've been producing this design for 40 damn years. If you go back and look at the original car, they don't want anything to get, you know. I had a 70 Nova when I was 16 years old in '83, and I loved and hated that car, but it was my first car, and I did a whole lot of stuff to it, and a whole lot of stuff with it, and learned to keep it running. And years later, they stopped producing Novas altogether. And then about a decade or so went by, and then they reintroduced a Nova. And the Nova looked absolutely nothing like any of the previous models of Novas. It's just like my model Nova did not look like the original model that came out in the late 50s, I think, or no, the early 60s. So, I mean, and mine was a 70, so, I mean, it had changed over to the 70s appearance, more of a sporty looking vehicle. So to have that kind of progression in development of mechs and tanks and stuff is perfectly acceptable. I mean, absolutely. And in some ways it can help define the older design from the newer design. So we put the original Atlas, again, the field against a modern Atlas, and the original Atlas, if it's tricked out right, can still hold its own against its modern equivalent. But, you know, it is what it is. How you want to look at it. So, like Confederation, breaking him down. And more tanks, more vehicles. Oh yeah, right. There's a nasty little bugger. Ammo hauler and this ammo loader, right? So it's an ammo carrier built, yeah, because the other thing that I always got a trick out of. We're going to field load our mechs in the field. These damn things are 10 meters tall, and their ammo bays are way up in the middle of this, that, and the other thing. How the hell did they get the ammo up there? Obviously, they had to have ammo carriers. They also had to have loaders of some sort. Or were they using another mech to load ammos? If it's the ammo comes in like a canister where you're just a cartridge, where you're just popping out the old cartridge and placing a new one in, that's quite feasible. But if you were hand loading all those missiles into the missile bay, so they, you know, how much time would that take, and how would you get them up there, etc., and things like that. So having vehicles, versions, so we can actually see something that gives us an answer is always nice. I mean, we care, not really, but you know, it's a matter of perspective. Like I said, I always enjoy these things, and I expect to go back and preview them and look at them individually, because some things I'll never ever field. This the BattleMechs. I think this is one of the very early designs that rolling kind of went in tandem with the Warhammer. I remember seeing a video. Somebody did a video on this stuff, and I read a little bit about it. So this was in that second generation of mechs that started coming out right after the introduction of the Mackie. Right? Oh, there's so much shit I've read and forgotten. It's crazy. Oh man. Right. What I'd like to have seen is this era's version of an aerospace and aircraft and aerospace craft TRO, but apparently that never happened. There's just not as big a demand for aerospace stuff, which is true. I mean, a lot of people didn't. Once again, you don't come to the table to play battle. You know, battle troops didn't do so hot in part because we're here for the big stompy robots, you know, and things that can be destroyed by them, as opposed to, you know, having a starfighter game. Because if you go back to the campaign stuff, this is where the campaign things really play out. There's a little bit of aerospace. There's some stuff going on here, but not very much. The campaign allows you to introduce things that you might not normally do. And so, like I said, if we're going to have a 10 session campaign, and then some maybe might consider that a mini campaign. And the idea is, once again, my mercenary battalion's been hired to come on this planet and raid this factory complex for X amount of things. And the house that owns everything and is defending the place, or perhaps the factory complex is a security detail that's defending the place. And we have fixed assets. This is what our units consist of. So your battle value be damned. At that point, your battle value means nothing. It really has no value in battle whatsoever when you're looking at it from that perspective. My battalion consists of a battalion command lance of 4 mechs and 3 platoon or 3 companies of mechs, or maybe 2 companies of mechs and one of a mixture of infantry and combat vehicles, potentially backed up by one additional company of support units, i.e. the logistics train and things that may need to go with that. And that would make sure that means that I would need enough dropship capacity to move my entire battalion and its support. And then the local defenders are based on their equivalent of a short battalion or a long battalion. Maybe it's 4 companies, but the companies are going to be a little less defined, a little less, a little greener than my guys or whatever. But that's how where your battle value comes in, is when we're trying to lay out the grand scheme, what we're facing, what we're invading with, and what we're facing. After that point, perhaps my first mission operation is to get to the surface of the planet. So perhaps the defenders has a couple air wings of or air lances of aerospace fighters or atmospheric fighters, and they're going to put up those 4 to 6 machines to contest my dropship's arrival. So my battalion has 2 aerospace lances, and we'll deploy them in addition to the weapon systems from my dropships, who are going to run the defender's arrow wing or gauntlet to get to the ground. And whatever success and loss for both sides during that first mission could be the end of. If I go in and my opponent manages to knock out one of my mech carriers, I lose an entire company, a Union class dropship goes down and takes the entire company with it, how much of a change is that going to make to my potential operation? Or am I going to make a decision I need to cut and run? What if my mech unit or my carrier is so badly beat up that it can't take off again, so now my mech units are at a disadvantage? My battalion's going to either, if they have to bug out, we're going to either have to abandon some equipment or figure out something. Ideally, in that scenario, you get enough attrition that it balances out. The idea of leaving a damaged dropship behind is almost unfathomable to most mercenary and house commands, but mercenaries specifically. So what do we do to try to salvage the situation? And if we had that aerospace combat in that first event, then we move on to the ground scenario. You see what I'm getting at? So everything has its place. It's like Mechwarrior. Mechwarrior, I always was using Mechwarrior as a more intimate setting. So if we're having a battle on the battlefield, well, obviously traditional Battletech is what we're doing. If we want to have something that deals with the pilots of those mechs having a confrontation with somebody outside the mechs, this is when we would bring the Mechwarrior rules in and have a bit of each. So I mean, just how do you play it in and play it out kind of stuff. It's just my take on how possibly to run campaigns as opposed to one-offs. One-offs are just that we're just getting together, beat up some big stompy mechs and pour bloody infantry and whatever for the afternoon, and nobody cares, right? Get on and get down the road. So then we got various. Okay, so we got Comsters. Comsters still a thing at this point. BTOL. Word of Blake. That's a nasty looking booger. Nasty looking booger. 6 LB 5X ACs. See, I always argued a lot of people hate the AC2 because the AC2, hey, it has phenomenal range. And its to hit ratio, at least if something's changed, is actually pretty good. The problem, as everybody knows, is it's just basically a tweak. I'm tweaking you because I'm not going to deliver at best maybe 1 point of damage. It might get exceptional and get the whole 2 points of damage, but it's just picking away at something and not really, unless we're able to shoot at something that's a soft body or very lowly, poorly armored, you're looking for that miracle shot. But if you could put 4 or 6 of these damn things on a weapon platform, they turned into a really impressive anti-aircraft weapon or anti-infantry weapon. So seeing something like this just kind of got, brought that argument and conversation I'd had for years about the AC2 to fruition. It's obviously not AC2, but the idea is still the same. Mercenary vehicles and mechs. All right, all good. Like I said, I haven't yet to meet a real TRO that's crap, but they're always nice, and I always enjoy them when I get a chance to look at them and read on it, and appreciate the fellow that sent me the PDF for this one. It's great shit, man. I'm just saying. Anyway, it's that kind of thing. It's that time where we say, lock and load? No. Buy bonds? No. Have a great weekend. There you go.